We start with a name many of you know, Harold Shipman, a general practitioner in Greater Manchester who was convicted of killing patients. His case sits at the top of public awareness, so it is the right place to begin before moving to cases that drew less attention but are no less disturbing. Harold Frederick Shipman was born in 1946 in Nottingham and qualified as a doctor in the United Kingdom. He worked as a GP for years and became a familiar figure in Hyde. Patients trusted him and local families stayed with his practice for a long time. There was one earlier issue on record in the 1970s when he was disciplined for forging prescriptions linked to his own use of painkillers. He returned to work, rebuilt standing, and carried on in general practice. That long runway of trust is part of why the next events went on for so long. The crimes involved giving strong opioid doses to patients who did not need them and recording the deaths as natural. Many of the people were older, but they were not in the final hours of life as the record suggested. The pattern ran for years. A death was recorded with a simple explanation. The doctor's signature closed the file, and the day moved on. On paper, it looked routine. In reality, it was a sequence of deliberate acts. The first clear break in that sequence came from people who saw patterns, not from a single eyewitness. An undertaker in Hyde noticed that a high number of deaths came from one practice and that the scenes were similar. A local GP reviewed death data and saw that Shipman had far more deaths linked to his name than others in the same area. Those concerns reached police. In June 1998, an event created firm ground for action. Kathleen Grundy, aged 81 and active in the community the day before, died at home. Shipman wrote old age as the cause. Soon after, a will appeared that left her estate to him. Grundy's daughter, a solicitor, reported concerns. Police ordered an exhumation. A forensic test found diamorphine in her tissues. That result, plus the will, moved the case from concern to evidence. Detectives widened the scope. They pulled cremation forms, visit logs, prescription records, and computer entries. They checked the timing of home visits against recorded deaths. They compared mortality data across practices and found that Shipman's numbers were far outside the norm. They also found that he was often the last medical professional to see a patient alive, and that post-death steps were handled quickly and quietly. Prosecutors selected 15 deaths where the documents and forensic work were strongest and added charges related to the forged will. The trial ran in late 1999. Expert witnesses explained how diamorphine acts and how dosage could end life without signs that would draw attention in a home setting. Handwriting experts walked the jury through why the will was false. Family members and staff described the practical details around the deaths and the paperwork that followed. In January 2000, the jury returned guilty verdicts. Shipman was convicted of killing 15 patients and of forging the will. The judge imposed a whole life sentence. In 2004, Shipman died in prison. After the trial, a public inquiry led by Dame Janet Smith reviewed hundreds of deaths. The inquiry concluded that the likely total number of people he killed was well over 200 across 2 decades. That number is an estimate built from medical records, cremation forms, and statistical analysis, and it is the scale that moved the case from local shock to national reform. The legal outcome was followed by changes in practice. The United Kingdom introduced stronger checks on death certification and controlled drugs. Systems were built to flag unusual patterns in mortality so that a cluster around one clinician is looked at early. Coroners and health bodies updated guidance for when to order post-death review. These steps do not retell the crime, but they explain what changed so that the same pattern is harder to repeat. Public reaction stayed strong for years because the facts were simple to grasp. A trusted GP had used access, records, and authority to carry out harm and hide it inside routine. Families asked why no one noticed sooner. Staff who raised the first concerns are now part of how the case is taught. because the starting point was not a dramatic scene. It was a person who compared numbers and spoke up. Today, if you read the inquiry reports and the trial summary, the sequence is clear. A doctor with prior issues returned to practice and built trust. He used a controlled drug to end lives. He signed forms that closed cases. A pattern in data triggered a closer look. A single exhumation and a forged will gave the case clear edges. The court reached a verdict that matched the records. The health system changed rules based on what the records showed. This case sets our theme for the series: power used inside a trusted role, and harm that hides in plain sight until data and documents are checked line by line. The next case keeps that theme, but changes the setting. Instead of a community GP and a paper trail, it takes us into a famous research hospital and a high-profile surgeon whose work drew cameras and praise. Paolo Macchiarini rose to fame as a surgeon who said he could replace a damaged windpipe with a plastic tube coated with a patient's own cells. He worked at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, a place linked to the Nobel Prize in Medicine, which gave his work a strong platform. Early talks and papers said the idea could help people who had very few options left. His background looked solid on paper. He trained and worked across Europe. He held respected posts and gave talks that drew large rooms. Profiles described a careful expert who moved fast for patients who were running out of time. The story sounded modern and urgent, and it traveled well across news outlets and medical meetings. The method was simple to explain. A lab would seed a plastic scaffold with cells from the patient. The claim was that the body would accept the tube and turn it into working tissue. Early updates described patients who could breathe better and leave the hospital. For families facing a hard choice, this sounded like a path to more time. Clinical reality did not match that promise. The synthetic tubes did not behave like living airways. They inflamed and stiffened. They failed to join with the body. Patients suffered infections and airway collapse. Several died within months. Staff who saw the patients each day could not square those outcomes with the public claims of success. Concerns began to move from hallway talk to formal notes. Doctors and researchers compared survival times in papers to hospital records and found gaps. Some patients had not met a clear last resort standard. Consent notes did not set out the risks in plain terms. People who worked with him filed complaints and asked for independent checks on data. In 2016, Swedish reporters aired a documentary that set out a clear timeline using records, interviews, and film from inside the hospital. The program said results were overstated and that warnings were raised but not acted on quickly. The public response was strong. Karolinska ordered reviews. Papers linked to the work were questioned and some were retracted. Senior leaders left their posts. Prosecutors in Sweden opened a criminal case. The focus was on harm to patients, false claims, and a breach of duty of care. Courts have to decide on facts that meet legal tests. In 2023, a Swedish court found that Macchiarini's actions caused the death of a patient and injuries to others, and sentenced him to prison. Appeals and filings followed, but the verdict put a legal judgment on the record. The impact did not end at one hospital. Centers in Europe and the United States reviewed how they approve high-risk procedures. Boards added checks for last resort claims. Consent forms were rewritten to show risk in direct language. Many places required outside review of outcomes before public claims of success. Journals tightened standards for case reports that come from headline projects. Media coverage stayed high because the story showed a simple rule. A strong idea is not enough. The numbers have to match. The Netflix series about the case and long-form articles walked viewers through the gap between promise and results. Families who lost loved ones said they wanted honesty at the start and proof that could be checked by people outside the team. This case also showed how praise can slow down good questions. Star power can make colleagues hold back when they should speak. Hospitals answered this by building better ways to raise concerns. Some created protected steps for nurses and junior doctors to flag problems. Others made it standard to call in a second team to check claims before they reached the press. Where is he now? He is out of major roles, carrying a criminal conviction from Sweden. His name is linked in public records to deaths and injuries that followed his surgeries. Medical bodies and employers that worked with him place limits on his practice. Legal debate will sit in the files for years, but the key facts are set in court records and review reports. The lesson for viewers is not complex. If a device does not act like living tissue, do not claim that it will. If results are uncertain, do not sell them as proven. If one team is excited, ask another team to verify the numbers. Trust is earned by data that can be checked. It is kept by saying no when the facts do not support the story. Policy changes that came after this case sound simple, but they matter. Clearer consent, independent audits, triggers that pause a project when harm rises. These steps do not stop research. They protect it by making sure proof comes first. Families who lived through this loss became strong voices for those rules, and their words helped shape the way hospitals now handle new ideas. Shipman hid harm inside routine. Macchiarini sold promise without proof. Next is Christopher Duntsch, a neurosurgeon whose damage happened in surgery, in plain view, and it kept happening even after warnings. Christopher Duntsch was a spine surgeon in Texas who left a long line of harmed patients in a very short time. He entered operating rooms with full privileges, wrote confident notes, and walked out leaving people in pain, paralyzed, or worse. The public knows him as Dr. Death because the damage was not hidden in charts or papers. It happened in surgery, in front of staff, and the scale forced prosecutors to act. His path looked strong on paper. He earned an MD and a PhD, finished a neurosurgery residency, and completed a spine fellowship. He arrived in the Dallas area in 2011 with letters that spoke well of him. Hospitals granted privileges. Marketing materials introduced a young specialist offering modern spine care. Patients saw a trained surgeon who said he could fix years of pain with a planned procedure and a short stay. Inside the operating room, results told a different story. Early cases at a major hospital in Plano drew concern from other surgeons who reviewed his technique and saw basic steps done out of order or not done at all. A friend who trusted him for neck surgery left the table unable to move and needed care for the rest of his life. A woman booked for a standard decompression bled heavily and died after a vessel was cut and the bleeding was not controlled. Records from those days show warnings to slow things down and to review his cases, but he soon moved to another hospital and then to an outpatient center where the pattern continued. Nurses and scrub techs raised alarms in real time. They saw misplaced screws, hardware set into soft tissue, and instruments used in ways that did not match training or common practice. They called for help from senior surgeons to review what had been done. Those surgeons opened patients back up and found damage that they described in clear, direct language. In one case, a sponge was left in a patient's throat and closed inside the wound. In another, a nerve root was cut and the wrong level of the spine was operated on. The harm was not subtle. It was visible on imaging and at the table. Why did he keep operating? Part of the answer sits in how hospitals share information. He resigned from one hospital before a formal hearing finished, which meant the case was not entered into the national database that flags problem doctors. At another site, he had temporary privileges, which did not trigger a reporting rule when they were pulled. References arrived late or said little. Each move reset the clock and let the next place start from scratch. At the same time, the state medical board process moved slowly, working through records while more patients were booked. The turning point came when local surgeons began to coordinate. They collected records, imaging, and notes from the worst cases and took them to prosecutors. They argued that this was not about a civil suit over standards of care, They said this was criminal harm in an operating room. Dallas County brought charges that centered on a single elderly patient who had woken after spine surgery with life-changing injury. Prosecutors chose a narrow path that met the criminal test and kept the story simple for a jury. The trial in 2017 was built on documents and clear expert testimony. Surgeons explained what a safe spine procedure looks like step by step, then showed how those steps were missed or reversed. Nurses and techs described calls for help that were ignored, and the moments they saw that something was going wrong. The defense argued that poor results do not prove crime, that medicine carries risk, and that a bad outcome is not the same as intent. The jury heard about the total pattern, but the legal focus stayed on one charge that fit the facts beyond a reasonable doubt. The verdict was life in prison for injury to an elderly person. It was a rare result in the United States, a criminal conviction for what happened during surgery itself. His license had already been suspended and then revoked. He is in state custody with his earliest parole years away. Civil suits worked on a separate track, but the criminal case set a clear public record of what happened in that operating room and what the law decided. Counting the full toll, news reports and court summaries show that more than 30 patients were left with serious harm, and at least 2 patients died during the short span he worked in Dallas. The details vary by source, but every official list points the same way. A cluster of bad outcomes tied to one surgeon in less than 2 years, most of them preventable, many of them visible on the first scan after surgery. That is why this case crossed from malpractice to criminal court. The fallout focused on systems. Hospitals rewrote rules for temporary privileges, peer review, and reporting. The state board refined how it handles urgent risk when a case is still under review. Committees now ask for outside eyes when a surgeon gathers an unusual number of bad outcomes in a short time. Staff at the bedside have clearer paths to escalate concern when a name carries weight and people are afraid to speak. For viewers, this is not about rare complications that can happen to any surgeon. It is about patterns you can see in a logbook. Wrong level surgery, hardware in muscle, a vessel cut and not controlled, a sponge closed inside a neck. These are the kinds of mistakes that draw a line in plain terms. They make it clear why other surgeons went to law enforcement and why a jury felt sure. Where is he now? In prison on a life sentence after being convicted of harming a patient in his care. The case inspired a popular podcast and a television series, which kept public pressure on the institutions tied to the story. Families still speak about mornings that started with hope and ended with a long recovery that never ended at all. Their accounts are the reason this case is taught in meetings and classrooms across the country. The next case takes us to a different kind of harm, where a breast surgeon in the United Kingdom performed operations that patients did not need, told them they faced risks they did not have, and sent many into years of fear and follow-up. Same core issue, a doctor with authority, but the method was consent and pressure rather than obvious error at the table. We start with a breast surgeon who used authority and paperwork to push patients into operations they did not need. Ian Paterson worked for years in the West Midlands, in both NHS and private hospitals, and many people trusted his advice. Complaints built slowly, then turned into a scandal that forced a criminal trial and a public inquiry. Paterson's record looked strong on the surface. He held senior posts, ran busy clinics, and spoke with confidence about risk and benefit. In reality, he often misrepresented diagnoses, overstated the chance of cancer, and scheduled major operations that were not required. One method he used was a so-called cleavage-sparing mastectomy, which left breast tissue behind and increased the chance that disease could return, yet patients were not told that this was outside guidance. The pattern came into focus through ordinary steps. Patients compared notes. GPs and oncologists raised concerns about repeat operations and results that did not match standard care. Records showed that people were told they faced high risk, and then booked for mastectomy or wide excision when imaging and pathology did not support that plan. When colleagues reviewed his outcomes, they found incomplete surgery, poor documentation, and consent that did not set out the real choices. Those findings moved from clinic rooms to investigators. Police gathered files from both the Heart of England NHS Foundation Trust and private sites run by Spire Healthcare. They looked at clinic letters, pathology reports, and recall lists. The clearest cases were selected for criminal charges that a jury could weigh without expert confusion. Prosecutors focused on wounding with intent and unlawful wounding, built from records that showed people had been cut without medical need. In 2017, a jury found Paterson guilty. He was convicted of 17 counts of wounding with intent and 3 counts of unlawful wounding. The judge first imposed a 15-year sentence. After appeal, the Court of Appeal increased that sentence to 20 years, stating that the original term was too low for the scale of harm. Sentencing did not close the case. The government ordered an independent inquiry to examine how he was able to keep operating in both sectors, despite repeated warnings. The Paterson inquiry reported in February 2020, chaired by the Right Reverend Graeme James. It described a system that failed to protect patients, and it set out recommendations on consent, complaints, and oversight that apply to both NHS and private care. Money followed the truth. In 2017, a compensation deal of about £37 million was agreed for hundreds of victims, paid by Spire Healthcare along with insurers and the NHS Trust. After the inquiry, Spire created a further fund and recalled more former patients for review. Thousands were contacted so their care could be checked. The public story did not fade. Inquests have since been opened to examine whether deaths linked to his work were natural or not, and to test where the system failed. Reports in 2023 and 2024 describe how his cleavage sparing technique left tissue behind, and how concerns were raised years earlier, but did not stop him. He remains in prison on a 20-year term while those inquests work case by case. What made this case so hard to spot was its shape. There was no single event that forced action. It was a long run of clinic visits and letters that looked official. People who questioned him had to push through status, private sector rules, and a process that moved slowly. The inquiry called this a system failure and set out ways to stop it happening again, including stronger consent, clear duty to share information across sectors, and a single standard for recall and review. For those who lived through it, the harm was not just surgery and scars. It was years of fear, extra treatment, and loss of trust in medical advice. Many describe being told that an urgent operation was the only sensible path, only to learn later that the pathology did not match the story. Their accounts kept attention on the case and helped drive reform in both public and private care. Where does that leave us? A surgeon who used authority to push major surgery without proper need, a conviction that set clear legal blame, and a set of reforms that now sit in policy. Hospitals and regulators still review old files and call people back if questions remain. The work is slow, but it matters, because the risk here did not sit on a single day. It sat inside advice that sounded expert and kind. The next case takes the same pattern and moves it into cancer care, where an oncologist in the United States gave powerful chemotherapy to patients who did not even have cancer. The tools change, the method is the same, and the outcome is measured in lives turned upside down. Farid Fata was a Michigan oncologist who turned cancer care into a money machine. He owned a large practice in the Detroit area and presented himself as a careful specialist who moved fast for people in trouble. Patients came in scared and left with a plan that sounded firm. Many did not have cancer at all. They still received powerful drugs and long courses of treatment because he said they needed them. His path into authority looked solid. He trained in internal medicine and oncology, built a private network of clinics and infusion centers, and admitted patients to local hospitals. He spoke with quiet certainty, used medical terms that sounded precise, and sent bills to public and private insurers that showed complex care. That mix of confidence and access made people say yes when he recommended chemotherapy, growth factors, and repeated scans. The core of the crime was simple. He told people they had cancer or a high risk of cancer when the records did not support it. He ordered and gave chemotherapy to patients who did not need it. He gave strong drugs for far longer than guidelines allow. He scheduled infusions on tight cycles that made billing rise. He used expensive growth factor shots as routine rather than as needed. The plan on paper looked aggressive. In reality, it was harm tied to profit. The first serious break in the story came from inside the practice. A physician who had joined the group reviewed charts and saw test results that did not match the treatment plans. A patient labeled as having a blood cancer had normal marrow. Others were listed as needing maintenance chemo with no clear reason. The doctor took those files to federal agents. In August 2013, agents arrested Fata at his office. Patients who were sitting in infusion chairs learned from news alerts that the man running the clinic was in custody. From that point, the case moved on documents. Investigators pulled pathology reports, imaging, lab values, chemo orders, and billing records. They compared diagnoses to national standards. They found people who received months of toxic drugs for conditions they did not have. They found people who were placed on growth factor shots after small procedures that did not call for them. They found patterns that fit a fraud plan. Bill for as much as possible by keeping the drugs flowing. The human cost was heavy. Some patients were made weak and sick by drugs they did not need. Some had veins scarred and immune systems damaged. Families said they trusted the plan because it came from a specialist and because the clinic looked professional. People who did have cancer lost time on the right treatment while they were pushed through the wrong one. A few died during or after courses that did not match their condition. Even when a patient survived, the months of fear and the side effects did not vanish with an arrest. Federal prosecutors charged Fata with healthcare fraud, kickbacks, and money laundering. In 2014, he pleaded guilty. The judge asked him in open court if he knew he was giving unnecessary treatment to people who placed trust in him. He said yes. In 2015, he was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. The court said the length reflected the scale of harm and the way he used medicine to take money and to take health from people who had done nothing but seek care. The civil side moved on a separate track. Hospitals that hosted his clinics and the practice itself faced lawsuits. There were settlements with insurers and with patient groups. The state and the federal government built a claims process so that people could recover part of what was taken. None of this restored health, but it did build a public record of what happened and who paid for it. The case forced changes. Hospitals and payers now look harder at outlier patterns in oncology. When a single clinic orders far more of a drug than peer groups, that triggers a review. Many centers now require a second look on long courses that extend past guidelines. Pathology reports are shared more openly with patients and referring doctors, so the plan cannot rest on one person's word. Insurers and boards also began to use simple screens, like the rate of growth factor use after minor surgery, as an early warning. Media coverage remained strong because the facts are easy to grasp. People who did not have cancer got chemotherapy because a doctor told them they did. Courtroom footage, local news, and national reports kept attention on the numbers and on the faces behind those numbers. Documentaries focused on the moment patients learned the truth and on the quiet details that helped the case break open, like a second opinion that did not match the first. What does this teach? First, that consent means little if the diagnosis is false. A person can agree to chemo only if the cancer is real. Second, that patterns in data can save lives. When billing for a drug towers over peers, someone needs to ask why. Third, that a white coat and a private clinic can hide almost anything until a staff member decides to speak and backs that choice with files. Where is he now? In federal prison on a 45-year sentence. The practice he built is gone. Patients who want their records can request them from the agencies that hold the case files. Some still attend hearings to speak about what the drugs did to them and how long it took to learn the truth. Their words keep the reforms in place. Paterson pushed surgery people did not need. Fata did the same with chemotherapy, and the harm was real even when the cancer was not. Next is Michael Neary in Ireland, where unnecessary hysterectomies went on for years inside a trusted hospital. Michael Neary was a consultant obstetrician and gynecologist at Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital in Drogheda for many years. He delivered babies, taught junior doctors, and built the standing that comes with long service. On paper, it looked like a steady career inside a busy maternity unit. What later came into view was the scale of hysterectomies carried out under his care and the way those decisions were made. The numbers were not small. Reviews found more than 129 hysterectomies linked to childbirth during his time at the hospital, far beyond what other units reported over similar periods. Many women later said they had not been told they were losing their wombs or that the surgery could not be undone. Some said they were not told there were other options. Others said they were told the situation was life-threatening when the records did not support that level of risk. The pattern did not rely on a single case. It was volume, repetition, and decisions that did not match good practice. Staff were the first line in the story. Midwives and doctors who worked on the ward began to compare outcomes and saw that hysterectomy rates after birth were far higher under one consultant than under others. They raised concerns. Managers and external reviewers looked at files and could not square the rate of severe bleeding noted in notes with the rate of radical surgery that followed. That gap was the heart of the problem. If the emergency was not present, the removal was not justified. As complaints grew, regional and national bodies stepped in. Files were pulled from storage and read against guidelines. Consent forms were checked for plain language and clear choice. Women were invited back to speak about what they were told and what they signed. The Lourdes Hospital inquiry was set up to put the facts on record. Its report said that many of the hysterectomies performed were not clinically necessary. It also said that governance failed. Audits that should have flagged an outlier did not lead to action. A culture of deference to a senior figure kept people quiet. Poor documentation made scrutiny harder than it should have been. The medical council took its own route. It opened a professional conduct case that focused on the mismatch between clinical need and the operations carried out, and on consent that did not meet the standard patients deserve. In 2003, the council struck Neary off the medical register. That decision removed his right to practice medicine in Ireland. Criminal charges did not follow, but the regulatory finding set the public record and allowed civil cases to move. Compensation followed over time. Settlements and schemes were set up so that women who had been harmed could be paid and could receive ongoing care. None of this reversed the surgery, but it acknowledged the damage and the breach of trust. The hospital and the health system issued formal apologies. That is written language, but it matters to people who felt they were pushed through a decision they would never have chosen if the facts had been set out clearly. The changes that came after the inquiry were practical. Consent had to be clear, recorded, and truly informed. A second opinion became standard for major life-changing decisions in maternity care. Outlier detection in surgery rates moved from an idea to a requirement. When one clinician shows figures that stand far outside peers, a review now starts early. Training for consultants and trainees added straight lines on documentation and on how to speak about risk without pressure. The aim was simple. You do not get to hide a major step inside routine words. The person in front of you must understand and must agree without fear. public attention stayed strong because survivor accounts were direct and easy to understand. Women spoke about going into theater expecting a repair and waking to find their fertility gone. Some were young and had planned more children. Others described the long run of health effects that follow a hysterectomy. These accounts were not dramatic set pieces. They were short statements that cut through the noise. I was not told. I did not consent. I was told there was no choice. Neary has not returned to practice since he was struck off. The inquiry and the medical council decision still stand as the key public documents. Hospital systems continue to track rates, and recall work has brought many patients back for review of scans, notes, and long-term care. For some, the process is still open years later, because the impact of the original decision sits not only in a single chart entry, but in family life and in health that changes with age. There is a straight link from the last case to this one. Farid Fata used the language of cancer care to push months of harmful treatment that people did not need. Neary used the authority of a senior obstetrician to push a permanent operation that many did not need and did not consent to with full knowledge. In both, trust and status carried the day until numbers and files were read line by line. The next step keeps the focus on unnecessary operations, but shifts country and motive. In Milan, prosecutors said a senior surgeon carried out major procedures people did not need in a private clinic to drive income. Different system, same core danger when oversight fails. Pier Paolo Brega Massone was a senior surgeon at the private Santa Rita Clinic in Milan. For years, he ran busy operating lists, trained junior staff, and billed the regional health service for complex procedures. On paper, it looked like high-output care. Investigators later said it was something else. They found a pattern of major operations that patients did not need, booked to drive reimbursements rather than to fix real problems. The first clear warnings came from audits and billing checks. Claims for serious procedures did not match the diagnoses. Charts showed people with minor symptoms listed for operations that carried heavy risk. Families who sought a second opinion were told the surgery had not been indicated. As the threads were pulled together, prosecutors said the clinic's high numbers were not a sign of excellence, but a red flag for fraud and harm. The Santa Rita story moved from a private dispute to a national scandal. Italian media called it the Clinic of Horrors. Police seized files. They compared theater logs, pathology reports, and imaging against what was billed. They recorded staff who said decisions were pushed through fast and consent was thin. They also tied specific patient injuries and deaths to operations that should never have happened. In 2010, a Milan court sentenced Brega Massone to 15.5 years in prison for a first set of counts tied to bogus procedures. Other doctors at the clinic received prison terms. A second, larger trial followed. In 2014, the court said 4 patient deaths were linked to unnecessary surgery and convicted him of murder in those cases, along with dozens of assaults. The judge called him cruel and malevolent in open court and imposed a life sentence. The ruling made headlines across Europe. Appeals changed the numbers, but not the core finding. Higher courts reduced parts of the life term to long fixed sentences, including rulings that labeled some deaths as homicide beyond intent rather than intentional murder. Reports describe outcomes in the range of 15 to just over 20 years across the appeal stages. What did not change was the legal record that he sent people to major surgery without need, and that harm and death followed. The case forced questions about how a private hospital could run at high volume for so long without an outside check. Insurers and regional health offices introduced extra steps for high-risk procedures, including stricter pre-authorization and random case audits. Regulators built data screens to spot outlier rates for specific operations so that a site can be flagged early. Consent rules were rewritten in plainer language so that patients see real choices. Boards added a trigger for an independent review when a surgeon's volume or billing jumps fast. These measures may sound routine, but they are the tools that catch patterns before they become headlines. The harm to patients was not abstract. People with minor issues went through thoracic and other invasive procedures that left them with pain, long recovery, and, in some cases, permanent damage. Some families lost relatives and then learned in court that the operation had not been necessary. Civil cases followed the criminal rulings. Settlements and compensation schemes helped cover ongoing care. Money did not restore health, but it acknowledged fault and forced institutions to change. Doctors who worked elsewhere said the case made them rethink checks inside their own clinics. A common theme was the need for a second look when a plan feels off. Another was a clear pathway for staff to flag concern without fear that senior status will silence them. In interviews after the trials, Italian health officials said private and public hospitals alike should be held to the same reporting standards on outcomes and adverse events. That is now the direction of policy. What stands out in this story is how many points of control failed at once. Billing screens did not trigger fast enough. Consent was treated as a signature rather than a real talk about options. Peer review was weak. Patients trusted the uniform and the schedule, and the system did not give them a strong backstop. When all of those things line up the wrong way, one surgeon's choices can shape the lives of many people in a short time. Where is Brega Massone now? He remains a convicted surgeon under long prison sentences set across his cases, with appeals that adjusted length but not the facts on the record. The clinic is a cautionary name in Italian healthcare. When journalists and officials talk about corruption risk in private hospitals, they still point to Santa Rita as a case that changed how oversight should work. For viewers, the lesson is direct. If one clinic or one doctor shows a much higher rate of major procedures than peers, someone must check the files. If a consent form lists a large operation for a small problem, a second opinion is not a delay, it is protection. If billing rises in step with a single surgeon's schedule, an audit is not an insult. It is part of care. This follows from the last case. Michael Neary used senior status in a public maternity unit to carry out hysterectomies that many patients did not need. Here, a private clinic turned surgery into revenue. In both, the power of a title and a white coat stood in for proof, and patients paid the price. The next case shifts from operating lists to exam rooms in New York, where a gynecologist used routine visits to abuse patients over years, and the hardest questions were not about billing or technique, but about how so many warnings were missed. Robert Hadden worked as a gynecologist tied to Columbia University Irving Medical Center and New York Presbyterian in New York City. For years, he saw patients for routine exams, prenatal care, and follow-up visits. That role carries private contact and a duty to protect patients. Complaints later showed he used that access to abuse people during visits, including very young patients. The pattern did not begin with one report. Patients across many years described conduct during exams that had no medical purpose. Some said they were touched in ways that did not match the stated exam. Some said they were left alone with him without a chaperone when one should have been present. Others said they tried to speak up and felt ignored, or were not shown a clear path to file a complaint. Those accounts built over time until they reached prosecutors and regulators. Early criminal action came in state court. In 2016, he took a plea that required him to give up his medical license. He did not receive a prison term at that time. Public response was strong. More patients came forward. Their accounts drew national attention and pushed the case into federal court, where charges focused on using his role to bring patients across state lines for abuse. A federal jury reached its decision in January 2023. Jurors found him guilty on counts tied to enticing and inducing patients to travel so he could commit abuse in his office. The court heard from witnesses about how the pattern worked and why it lasted so long. In July 2023, the judge imposed a 20-year prison sentence. He was taken into federal custody. The civil side moved in parallel. Hundreds of former patients filed lawsuits against Columbia and its hospital partners. They said the institutions failed to protect them and failed to act on early warning signs. Settlements built in stages over several years. In May 2025, a new agreement set a payment of about $750 million for 576 claimants. With earlier settlements, total payouts in cases linked to Hadden now exceed $1 billion. The size matters because it reflects both the number of people affected and the finding that institutional oversight fell short. Columbia issued public statements and set up a settlement fund website with information for former patients. The medical center also said it sent letters to thousands of people who had been seen by Hadden and created a process for claims and support. These steps were part of a wider plan to address past abuse and improve safeguards. Policy changes followed. Clinics strengthened chaperone rules for sensitive exams. Patients were given clear options to request a different provider without pressure. Staff received training on how a proper exam should be conducted and documented. Records now note who was in the room and why. Reporting paths were made simpler and safer so that concerns can be raised and acted upon. None of these steps undo past harm, but they reduce blind spots that allow abuse to hide. Media coverage remained intense for several reasons. First, the setting was a major university hospital system that many people trust. Second, survivor accounts were consistent and specific over a long period. Third, the difference between the 2016 state plea and the 2023 federal conviction raised questions about how abuse in medical settings is handled. Investigations by national outlets showed how early warnings did not stop the pattern, and how survivors and advocates kept pressure on institutions and prosecutors. The human impact is direct. Many patients say they lost trust in medical care and delayed needed treatment for years. Others describe the stress of being asked to return to a building where the abuse took place in order to pick up records or speak to investigators. Some say that having a chaperone in rooms now helps. Others say that what helps most is clear acknowledgement from leadership that the system failed and that rules have changed. The large settlements pay for counseling and medical care, but the goal many survivors name is simple. They want to be sure this cannot happen again in the same clinics. Why did this last so long? Several factors show up in the record. Patients often felt alone and unsure of how to report. Some feared they would not be believed. Some did file complaints and did not see strong action at the time. The doctor had status and worked at a respected center, which created hesitation in others. Over time, as more accounts matched, the pattern became undeniable. That growing record is what led to the federal trial and the long sentence. Where is he now? He is serving a 20-year federal sentence. His medical license is gone and his professional life is over. Civil cases continue to resolve, and the settlement fund remains open to claims on a timeline set by the administrator. Columbia and the hospital system say they are still reviewing policies and contacting former patients. The facts that matter most are now public and can be checked in court records and official releases. This case follows the pattern we just saw with the private clinic in Milan. There, surgery and billing turned into harm. Here, routine exams turned into abuse. In both, status helped the harm continue until volume and matching accounts forced action. The next case steps back into surgery, but in a different country. It looks at Jayant Patel in Australia, where poor outcomes and weak oversight in a regional hospital turned into a national review of how warnings move through a system. Jayant Patel was a hospital surgeon whose name became a national issue in Australia. He had a history of problems in the United States, moved to Queensland in 2003, and soon drew complaints about the number and quality of his operations. Newspapers called him Dr. Death. Public pressure led to inquiries, court cases, and changes to how hospitals check a surgeon's record before hiring. His background matters because it explains how warnings were missed. In Buffalo, New York, regulators fined him and put him on probation in the 1980s for poor preoperative practice. Years later, New York withdrew his license. In Oregon, his employer restricted his scope after bad outcomes, and the state board later made those limits apply statewide. Despite that record, letters of support helped him move on. These steps are on file in state actions and in later reporting. Queensland hired him as director of surgery at Bundaberg Base Hospital under an area of need program that aimed to fill posts in regional centers. He took on a senior role with broad influence over surgical work. Staff expected a leader who could handle complex cases and teach younger doctors. Instead, a pattern of harm and high complication rates began to surface across a short span of time. He also lacked Australian specialist recognition, which later became part of the story about vetting and oversight. The first strong pushback came from inside the hospital. Nurses and doctors kept notes on cases that went badly. Concerns went up the chain. When media began to report on the cluster of poor outcomes, families came forward with names and dates. The Bundaberg Hospital Commission of Inquiry was set up, followed by further reviews after legal challenges to the first inquiry's process. These inquiries gathered records, heard witnesses, and recommended criminal charges and policy reform. As pressure grew, Patel left Australia for the United States in April 2005. A warrant was issued the next year, and he was arrested in Oregon in 2008. He was extradited to Queensland to face trial. These dates matter because they show the time it took to collect evidence across many cases and to move an international arrest through the courts. In 2010, a Queensland jury found him guilty of 3 counts of manslaughter and 1 count of grievous bodily harm. The judge imposed a 7-year sentence. The deaths in those counts occurred while he worked at Bundaberg between 2003 and 2005. The verdict reflected the court's view at that time that his actions during surgery had caused unlawful deaths and serious injury. In 2012, the High Court of Australia quashed those convictions and ordered a retrial. The court held that the original jury had heard prejudicial material that should not have been put before them, and that this had affected the fairness of the trial. High court rulings focus on process, not on every detail of the facts. The decision did not say patients were not harmed. It said the trial had not met the legal standard. A 2013 retrial on one of the manslaughter counts ended in acquittal. Prosecutors then dropped the remaining manslaughter and grievous bodily harm charges in exchange for Patel pleading guilty to 4 fraud charges linked to how he gained registration and employment in Queensland. He received a 2-year suspended sentence on those fraud counts. Later that year, and in 2015, regulators completed actions that permanently banned him from practicing medicine in Australia. Those legal turns can be hard for the public to parse. People saw early headlines about manslaughter, later headlines about acquittal, and then a suspended sentence for fraud. What stayed constant was the record of poor outcomes at Bundaberg and the system failures that let a surgeon with known restrictions work in a high-authority post. The inquiries aimed to fix those failures. They looked at how overseas trained doctors are vetted, how references are checked, and how warnings move between hospitals and regulators. Policy steps followed. Queensland and national bodies improved credential checks for overseas trained doctors. Hospitals were told to verify claims directly with regulators, not just rely on letters. Reporting rules for adverse outcomes were strengthened, and flags for outlier results were added to internal dashboards. Whistleblower paths were improved so that nurses and junior staff could raise concerns and have them escalated without delay. None of these steps rewrite history, but they reduce the chance that one person's record will be missed by a busy system. The human side of the story is clear in press accounts and in the inquiries. Families describe people who went in for surgery and did not come home, or came home with life-changing harm. Staff describe the stress of speaking up in a small regional hospital, where saying no to a senior figure can feel risky. These accounts explain why the story did not fade after the court process. It became a symbol of what happens when checks fail and how hard it is to correct course once harm is underway. Where is Patel now? After the fraud sentence and the regulatory ban, he left Australia. He remains an example used in training and in policy papers about credentialing and the sharing of warnings across borders. His name still appears in media whenever hospitals discuss vetting, because the case merged three elements that health systems fear most: a prior record that went unseen, a senior job in a small town with limited backup, a long delay between the first warning and a full stop. This follows directly from the last case. Robert Hadden abused power in a clinic room, and institutions missed the signs. Here, a hospital put a surgeon with a known record into a senior role, and bad outcomes mounted before the system reacted. The next case stays in Australia and looks at Graeme Reeves in New South Wales, where a gynecologist's conduct in small hospitals and private rooms led to bans, criminal charges, and a long public debate about how to keep patients safe when a doctor works across several sites. Graeme Reeves was an obstetrician and gynecologist who worked in New South Wales over several decades. He held posts in small hospitals and saw patients in private rooms. Many women went to him for routine care, births, and minor procedures. Over time, complaints built that he carried out treatments without consent, ignored standards, and abused his role. Australian media later called him the Butcher of Brega. The name stuck because the stories lined up across years and across towns. His career history matters because it shows how problems were missed. He trained in Australia and gained specialist recognition. He moved between regional hospitals and private clinics. In small communities, a visiting specialist can gain fast trust because options are limited. Letters and titles help. Reeves used that standing to keep seeing patients even as warnings began to surface. Some warnings sat inside files. Others were spoken by staff who felt they lacked a clear path to be heard. The core issues were consent and conduct. Women said they agreed to one procedure and woke to find that more had been done. They said they were not told about risks or options. Some said they were told a drastic step was the only safe path when the record did not show an emergency. Others described painful exams that did not match any medical need. In many accounts, there was no chaperone in the room. Notes were brief and did not list why a choice had been made. When later reviewers looked at the charts, they could not find the facts that should be there in any good record. The first strong push against Reeves grew in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Patients and staff raised concerns with local managers and with state bodies. Healthcare Complaints Commission files began to fill with matching themes. In 2004, he was struck off the medical register in New South Wales. That decision should have ended his work as a doctor. Instead, he kept seeing some patients and kept his name alive in private settings. That gap between a formal ban and what happened on the ground would become part of the public debate. Media reporting played a major role. Investigative TV programs took accounts from women who said they were harmed in small hospitals on the far south coast and in Sydney, rooms linked to Reeves. The broadcasts used documents and interviews to show patterns rather than a single case. After those programs aired, more women came forward. The number of matching accounts shifted the story from rumor to record. Government ministers took questions in Parliament. State bodies set up hotlines. The tone changed from denial to action. Police opened a wide inquiry with health regulators. They gathered medical records, consent forms, theater logs, and statements. They sought expert opinions on whether a treatment was needed and whether the consent was real. In many files, the same issues appeared: incomplete notes, no record of risk being explained, no clear reason for an invasive step. Prosecutors filed criminal charges for assaults tied to conduct in the clinic and for procedures done without proper consent. There were also charges for practicing while banned. Courts tend to move slower than headlines, but in these matters, they focus on what can be proved with documents and clear testimony. In 2011, a jury found Reeves guilty on multiple counts, including assaults against patients. The judge set a prison term measured in years, not months. Appeals followed, as they do in serious cases, but the core findings stood. He was also barred from practice by medical boards in formal terms that would remain in force even if he were ever released. For many women, the conviction offered public confirmation of what they had said for years, even if it did not undo the harm. The civil side moved on a different track. Lawsuits were brought against hospitals and against Reeves. Settlements and ex gratia payments were made. Money cannot reverse a life-changing surgery or erase an assault, but it pays for counseling, follow-up care, and time away from work. The size of the payouts and the number of claimants showed the scope of the problem. Institutions issued public apologies. Leaders said they would change rules so that a ban on paper becomes a real stop in practice. Policy changes after the case were practical and clear. Hospitals tightened credential checks for visiting specialists and set shared rules for chaperones in sensitive exams. A single statewide system began to track complaints so that patterns show up even if a doctor moves between sites. Consent rules were rewritten in plain language. Any life-changing step now requires clear notes and, in many places, a second opinion. Staff were given protected ways to report concerns without fear. Health bodies also improved how they share information with police when a banned doctor tries to keep working in private rooms. Public interest stayed strong because survivor accounts were direct and specific. Many said they went in for a simple repair and woke to find a major procedure had been done. Some were told they could no longer have children. Others said they left routine care with lasting pain. These are not abstract policy examples. They are short, hard sentences that point to a real person in a small town who trusted a doctor because there were not many choices. Why did this take so long to stop? The record shows several reasons. Small hospitals can be close-knit, and junior staff may fear speaking against a senior specialist. Some women did not know how to report or felt ashamed. Others did report and were not believed at first. Paper checks failed, and the ban did not reach every place where he worked. Only when media, police, and regulators pulled the files together did the full picture form. Where is Reeves now? He is a deregistered doctor with criminal convictions and a long prison sentence on his record. He is not allowed to practice medicine. His name still appears when Australia debates how to keep patients safe in small hospitals and in private rooms. The reforms that followed his case have been folded into training and daily routines. They are not dramatic. They are checklists, countersignatures, and the right to say no without losing care. This last case brings the series to a close with the same simple point that runs through them all. Titles and rooms do not protect patients. People and rules do. When records are clear, consent is real, and warnings move fast, harm is harder to hide. When any of those fail, even a small clinic can carry a very large cost. If you stayed with me to the end, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop a comment with where you are watching from and which story stood out to you. Thanks for tuning in, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.